Hello, everybody, and welcome to Nathan on Shuffle, and to this episode, my latest episode of the Beginner's Guide series that I'm doing this year. Every month, I'm highlighting a different classic prog band, and for February, I'm highlighting Rush. And so this is the Beginner's Guide to Rush for those who are interested in getting into the band, or who are already fans and are just interested in my perspective. Welcome aboard. I'm going to talk a bit briefly about their history and about, where they've come, and talk about my experience discovering the band and how I feel about their music, and finish with some recommendations for new fans of good places to start if you're wanting to explore a bit further into this band. So Rush, they were formed in Toronto, Canada in 1968. The classic trio lineup is Geddy Lee on bass guitar, keyboards, and vocals, Alex Lifeson on guitar, and Neil Peart on drums, percussion, and of course writing lyrics, which he's become well known for. The band was formed back in 1968 with Lifeson, drummer John Rutsey, and bass guitarist vocalist Jeff Jones, who was replaced by Geddy Lee fairly quickly. After Lee joined, the band went through some lineup changes and ultimately settled on bringing in Neil Peart to replace Rutsey in July 1974, 4 months after the release of their first album, their self-titled record. And since then, the band lineup hasn't changed. And that's one of the cool features of Rush, is that they've had this same lineup throughout their whole storied career, all throughout the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and into the 2000s. They've stayed this core trio and haven't replaced any members, haven't added any new members. They've just stayed true to their core. And only the first album doesn't have all three of the members on it. The first album doesn't have Neil Peart, but he joins for Fly By Night, their second record, which is sort of where they started with their critical acclaim as well. Their first album, not that it wasn't received well, but I just don't think it really made too much of a mark. But they really got some acclaim for their album, Fly By Night. But then critics were disappointed a bit by Caress of Steel, which was a little bit of a down spot. But then once they came out with 2112, they soared in the heights of people's opinions of them. Just an excellent progressive masterpiece that was really beloved and still is beloved to this day. So they've gone through several different phases throughout their career. I think that's what's interesting about them. Their early phase, back in that 1974 to 1976 range, is when they were more into this kind of hard rock blues kind of flavor, almost sounding similar to Led Zeppelin at the time. With little experiments into more complex tracks, especially on Fly By Night, and then blossoming more on 2112. But in that first record, it's pretty standard blues rock sort of flavor, but played really well and with some really cool tracks. Their second phase is when they got into that more progressive rock phase, starting with that 2112 album, but really exploding with A Farewell to Kings, and then, of course, Hemispheres, and then continuing forward with Permanent Waves and Moving Pictures even. This is the core of their progressive rock period that everyone points to as the classic albums for that type of sound from the band, where they were able to really explore some really complex instrumentation, add a little bit of synthesizer work to pad out their sound, but still stay to the core of who they are as a trio and not sacrifice that core trio sound as well. And where Neil Peart really excelled as a lyricist. He writes lyrics that are sci-fi in nature, fantasy sci-fi themed, but with philosophical concepts and based upon literature and history and things of that nature, and really brought the band to another level, and why a lot of people love their music, not just for their talent as musicians, but also for their thoughtful lyrics and the storytelling that they're able to do at the same time. So they moved into more of an 80s type phase, embracing the 80s sound with Signals, all the way through to Hold Your Fire, adding more synthesizers and really embracing the sound of the time period. But what I think is really cool about the band is that they still don't sacrifice their core of who they are. They still have really incredible musicianship, really thoughtful, intelligent lyrics all throughout their career, and even including this period of the band. And then their later phase, you move into the 90s, 1990, all the way up till their final album, Clockwork Angels, in 2012. 2012 showcases the band kind of returning to their roots, getting back into more of a core rock sound, not doing as much with like the keyboards and synthesizers, but more focusing on the core elements of that bass, drums, guitar kind of trio for the band. And I think it worked out well for them with a couple of really late career highlights, especially to me. I think Counterparts is a fabulous record. I really love Snakes and Arrows as well, and I think Clockwork Angels is just a fabulous finale for them as a band back in 2012, where they returned a bit to their progressive rock roots with a bit of a conceptual record that showcased a continuous storyline all the way through, which gave Neil Peart another avenue to showcase his skills as a writer. So a really fabulous career. They've done so much as a band. They have several platinum albums, both in the US and in Canada. They've been nominated for several Grammy Awards, won several Juno Awards, won an International Achievement Award at the 2009 SOCAN Awards, inducted into the Canadian Music Hall of Fame in 1994 and Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2013. So a storied band that has many fans and followers, one of the most devoted fan bases from my experience of featuring them on the channel. And they're just a super cool group that really blends some great elements. You know, they're able to have that strong musicianship, but they never sacrifice melody and catchiness in their music as well, making for an experience that both people who enjoy more complex proggy music can enjoy, but also people who are maybe more casual listeners can also find a lot to enjoy, especially in some of their singles and popular eras of the band, like in the 80s. Just a fabulous band and a fabulous career from them. From my own experience, I actually didn't really discover the band back when I was discovering some of the other luminaries of the prog genre from my dad, such as Yes and Genesis and Gentle Giant. Those were his favorites. My dad's not really big into Rush, so that was more of a later in life discovery. Of course, I heard things here and there like Tom Sawyer, YYZ, you know, some of their bigger hits, Subdivisions and things. I think I just heard from being a rock music fan as I was growing up. But I didn't really fully explore the band till I was a bit older and had heard so many people raving about things like 2112 and Farewell to Kings and Hemispheres, that these were like touchstones of progressive rock that every true progressive rock fan has to experience and listen to consider themselves a real fan. So I listened to those records, fell in love with the sound of it. I was always skeptical of Rush just because I love a fuller sound. I love keyboards in my music, and I was worried that they'd focus too much on this core element of bass, drums, guitar, and wouldn't have some of the beefier sounds that can come from keyboards and flute and other types of instruments. But I think they're able to expertly craft their music where it sounds full and varied, even with just three musicians at the helm. And of course, there's plenty of synth and keyboard work that they introduce, even in their more progressive period of the band in the later 70s and into the 80s. So there's plenty to enjoy there, plenty of complex things. And as a fantasy sci-fi nerd, there was a lot in the lyrics to really connect with me as well. So it just was an instant connection. But my love of the band really stayed centered in 2112 through about Permanent Waves, Moving Pictures era. You know, that's where my interest in the band stayed and remained for a long time. And I didn't really branch out beyond those records until recently when I wanted to feature Rush this month on the channel. I've been delving into their records outside of that picture and finding a lot to love in every era of the band, in that later 80s era and then into the 90s, and some of those early records that I hadn't really given much attention to, like their self-titled debut, like Fly By Night. Those are fantastic records as well that showcase another side and flavor and flair to the band. So just a lot to really dig into as a progressive rock fan and just a rock fan in general, because I feel like as they progress through time, they probably got a little bit less progressive in their sound, at least moving away from the classic 70s progressive rock sound, still having progressive elements in terms of complex arrangements and doing things outside of the mold of just typical pop music, obviously. But I feel like they were moving with the times. You know, progressive rock from the 70s was out of style once you got into the 80s and into the 90s, and they were able to adapt so well into the different styles that came about, that more synthy kind of 80s rock sound, and moving into more of a grungy type sound in the 90s, and into the more alternative rock of the early 2000s. I think they were able to adapt to those styles and sounds remarkably well, but still stick to the core of who they are as artists. As for where to start for a newcomer, Moving Pictures is kind of the most obvious place to start because it's probably their biggest, most commercial album, but still retains a lot of that complexity that Rush fans really love from them. It has a sprawling progressive rock epic in The Camera Eye. It has a cool, quirky instrumental in YYZ. Just some really cool shorter tracks that showcase some of the more catchy, poppier side of the band without sacrificing their songcraft and musicianship. So I think that's an excellent place to go if you're just wanting to really experience more of the progressive rock side of their sound. I would say 2112 is another great entry point. The title track, especially of 2112, is just a fantastic story, sci-fi themed story told expertly with the music behind it. What I love about 2112 is that it's telling this fantastic story through the lyrics, but you also get a lot of musical cues that tell the story also, like how he's trying to learn how to play that instrument, the guitar. You hear him noodling with it before he finalizes on the melody of that section because he's just found this new instrument and is exploring music. You get that sense of exploration, adventurous spirit in the music and not just the lyrics, and I think they're able to tell stories through music expertly well. That's done about as best as it can be done on 2112, so that's a highly recommended starting point as well if you're into the progressive rock aspect. If you're more into the 80s style, more into that kind of poppier 80s synth style rock, I think Signals is another good start point for those who like that period of the band. It's a really cool record that still has some great arrangements and still captures a little bit of that progressive spirit that they're coming from, but brings it into a whole new era with a lot of catchy, cool music that I think the general public would really enjoy and like. And if you're more a fan of the more modern 90s style, like I said, Counterparts is an excellent record to get into that focuses more on kind of a 90s rock approach that I really enjoy as well. So those are some of the touchstones that I would go to. I think Moving Pictures probably overall showcases, it's a good culmination of still having those elements of their progressive rock sound, but also hearing touchstones of what would be to come on their more 80s style period that leads to a bit more accessibility in some of those records. The duology of Farewell to Kings and Hemispheres are probably more the advanced course for once you've kind of wet your beak on 2112 or Moving Pictures, whichever way you want to go from it. But then you can get into some really classic, amazing progressive rock if you're into that style. So that's where I go with Rush. I think that's a pretty good overview. Hopefully you guys appreciate this video and my discussion. Let me know in the comments your feelings about this. If you're an established fan and have some differing ideas about where to start in their discography, or have different little tidbits and information about their history that you want to talk about and introduce into the comments, I'd be more than happy to have those there. So thank you guys so much for joining me on this episode. I hope you've enjoyed it and that you'll join me on future episodes. So thank you, everybody. Bye.